The year is 2008. The US has just elected its first African-American president in Barack Obama. Taylor Swift is taking off into superstardom with the release of her sophomore album, Fearless. And superhero movies are becoming legitimized with the release of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight and the birth of the Marvel Cinematic Universe through Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk. It's been 2 years since Persona 3 hit shelves and became a huge domestic success for Atlus, and everyone's looking to the developers to produce a follow-up that will solidify the Persona series as a must-play not just in Japan, but worldwide. While Persona 3 might have been what saved Atlus from bankruptcy, and its relative success catapulted the franchise into relevance, it's hard to really overstate how Persona 4 did everything P3 did for the company times 100. Persona 4 was a massive success in Japan, and relative to the niche world of gaming and even nicher reach of JRPGs at the time, massively outsold expectations in the West and garnered even more interest when the 24-episode anime was licensed for North American release by major anime distributor Aniplex in 2011. While not much has been stated specifically about the condensed development period for Persona 4, which released almost exactly 2 years to the day after Persona 3 did, Hoshino has discussed in interviews the struggles the team had formulating and solidifying the plot, to the point they were still rewriting major plot events as late into development as when the voice actors were in the recording booths. So it can be inferred that the development of Vanilla Persona 4 ran into problems relating to the truncated timeline it was completed in. I mean, hell, you couldn't even go outside at night in Vanilla P4. While there are very few big changes from the original release of Persona 4 for the PlayStation 2 to its updated re-release Persona 4 Golden for the next generation handheld console, the PlayStation Vita, the vast majority of what worked and defined the game as successful remains intact and close to unchanged, while what was added is integrated virtually seamlessly. This being said, a big thing that was changed to comply with the major differences in hardware between the PS2 and PS Vita, and in turn extends to the PC port of Golden, is a huge overhaul to the lighting and visual effects across the board, which unfortunately is for the worse in this case. The PlayStation 2 is pretty well known to this very day in gaming circles for being the hardware to render particle effects, specifically fog, in a particular way that no console has been able to replicate exactly since, and which greatly elevated certain games that knew how to make good use of it in their art direction. This is very important for Vanilla Persona 4, as a huge visual motif for this game is the thick fog that covers the central town of Inaba, as well as the mystical TV world most of the combat takes place in, and how the idea of that fog ties into one of the game's central themes of uncovering the truth that the media tries to obscure from us. The fog is almost completely removed from the final version of Persona 4 Golden, and even a lot of the lighting that worked hand in hand with it to create the oppressive and mysterious atmosphere that defined the PS2 version is sadly completely absent, with nothing equivalent to replace it. This results in a bright, cheery visual aesthetic that no longer works to intentionally juxtapose for narrative purposes against the game's already lively graphic design direction and low-stakes comedic tone of the story. That's why, if you're playing the Steam PC port, I highly recommend downloading Reloaded 2 Mod Loader and making use of the P4G Fog Restoration mod made by Brawler Ace. While this mod is still being worked on actively, it's about 70% of the way done, and even in an unfinished state does so much to improve upon Golden's lighting and fog implementation to closer align with that of the PS2 version. It's not a one-to-one replication or anything, but the work being done on this mod is absolutely fantastic and makes a game with an already great atmosphere just that much better. While Persona 4 doesn't have nearly as much intrinsic overlap between mechanics and story as Persona 3 did, in turn the overall progression of the plot has a more linear structure of a murder mystery. As was the case with Persona 3, my discussion of the game will include minor and major spoilers for every version of Persona 4, so if you do not want to be spoiled, please proceed with caution. With that all out of the way, I urge you to sit back, relax, and come along with me as we relive our youths and dive headfirst into the world of Persona 4. Persona 4 begins with the player character, who, since the player names him themselves, I will once again be referring to as MC, steps off the train to greet his uncle and detective for the local police department, Ryotaro Dojima, along with his 6-year-old niece, Nanako Dojima, who have offered to have MC live with them in the small rural town of Inaba for the year his parents are working abroad. On MC's first day at school, his classmates, the sporty kung fu fanatic Chie Satanaka, the self-deprecating son of the manager of the shiny new chain of superstores in town, Yosuke Hanamura, and the polite beauty whose family owns the local traditional Japanese inn, Yukiko Amagi, gossip with him about a new urban myth, the Midnight Channel, where by watching the TV at midnight while it's raining outside, you will see the face of your soulmate. Immediately after this exchange, the school goes into lockdown as the dead body of a local news reporter, Mayumi Yamano, who has been wrapped up in a scandal after it was publicized she was acting as a mistress to the local politician Taro Namatame, is found draped upside down over a telephone pole in a residential district near the school. Later that night, MC tries out the Midnight Channel and to his surprise sees the hazy outline of a girl. As he reaches out to touch her image on the TV, he finds himself getting pulled into the screen, and after freeing himself is left to wonder what bizarre implications this might have for his new life in Inaba. The next day, another dead body is discovered belonging to the girl who initially found Mayumi Yamano's body, and the eldest daughter of the family that owns the town's local liquor store, Saki Konishi, posed in a similar manner to the previous one. MC tells Yosuke and Chie about his bizarre experience with the Midnight Channel, and even though they tease him about how far-fetched it sounds, they go to the shiny new department store in town, Junes's electronics department, to try it out anyway, and are all three dragged into the TV to find themselves in a strange world on the other side. They learn that both Yamano and Saki had been spotted in the world by a lonely inhabitant of it, the strange bear mascot costume Teddy, and eventually are thrust into the center of a murder case as they learn more about the TV world and the hostile monsters within it called shadows that have been killing whoever enters it. MC, Yosuke, and Chie awaken to their personas, a powerful personification of their soul's own fighting spirit, and form the investigation team as they attempt to uncover the truth of who's behind the murders, and save those that are being thrown into the TV world, starting with Yukiko, who's gone missing after recently appearing on the Midnight Channel. Over the course of the first half of the game, the investigation team manages to not only save the people from death at the hands of their look-alike shadows, which personify the parts of themselves they desperately want to repress, but also help them accept these worst parts of themselves and awaken to their personas to fight alongside them in the pursuit of the truth. Of course, there's the already established MC, Yukiko, Yosuke, and Chie, but also the local delinquent with a hidden soft side, Kanji Tatsumi, a retired teen idol struggling with the way the public objectifies her, Rise Kujikawa, the previously mentioned dweller of the TV world trying to understand his origins, Teddy, and later the prodigal young detective working with the Inaba PD on the murder case, Nato Shirogane. The first thing that strikes you about Persona 4 upon starting a new game is just how long the opening is before you can start the actual gameplay loop of leveling stats, spending time with social links, and fighting through the dungeons. An average first-time playthrough will clock about 3 hours of linear events that railroad you through all manners of establishing setting, characters, and the central mystery, which while paling in comparison to Persona 5's nearly 5-hour-long intro, still has far too many forced breaks and detours that weigh it down. Despite these issues, at its core, the starting hours to Persona 4 serve as an excellent introduction to set up the inciting events in a way that's as genuinely intriguing as some of the best murder mysteries of its kind. Compared to Persona 3, the game's pacing as a whole is executed with an ebb and flow to the events that feel natural when juxtaposed with the way the game breaks up time management. Tartarus was a nice experiment, but as I went over when I talked about P3 FES, there were a lot of problems with its implementation. Problems Persona 4 attempts to remedy by making major alterations to how dungeon crawling is structured while attempting to keep the fundamental identity intact. Instead of one big dungeon separated into currently accessible sections like Tartarus, Persona 4 has 7 total dungeons with an optional 8th dungeon you must complete to unlock the game's true ending, plus a 9th optional one added in Golden, which I don't have any footage of since I misjudged how much time I had to finish Marie's social link to unlock it. These dungeons unlock as the story progresses, and in practice work similarly to blocks in Tartarus with a predetermined number of floors, though this time with predetermined layouts. Since the medium amount of floors in each dungeon is around 10, give or take, the floors themselves are much larger than even the biggest floors of Tartarus would be, which while this does mean you spend more time in the dungeon, sadly doesn't actually do all that much to improve upon the monotony of traversing them. Some are accompanied by puzzles like certain hallways teleporting you to a different part of the dungeon, tiles that turn you to face the other way completely, or forced backtracking to previous floors to access new areas with key items. But even these attempts to add variety end up being more akin to annoying gimmicks than anything that would actually challenge most players. There are many more item chests which boast far more valuable rewards than most Tartarus chests ever did, which along with the reworking of the rare treasure hand enemies giving directly applicable benefits and massive amounts of EXP and money when defeated, instead of some random item that you would only reap the benefits of after leaving the dungeon like the weapon fusion system in FPS, is able to do quite a bit to refine the psychology of the push your luck style dungeon crawling towards one where the player actually does want to continue despite the risks. But even these improvements to balance the returns with the risk don't fucking matter, because upon returning to any given dungeon after leaving, the game just gives you the option to start from the floor you were on when you last left. This serves to highlight an overarching issue with the way Persona 4 chooses to modify the dungeon crawling and combat half of the game, where instead of attempting to find emergent solutions that retained the original ethos of the problematic elements, the developers opt to just remove them entirely and either replace them with something that has infinitely less dynamism, or just literally nothing at all, and in the process, sacrifice the integrity of their own work as designers by making lazy changes that appeal to the lowest common denominator of player complaints. This design philosophy is most apparent in the actual combat system, because even if the dungeons themselves aren't all that interesting to traverse, it wouldn't actually matter that much if the thing you did the most inside the dungeons, that being combat, was actually interesting, challenging, or fun. At all. Don't get me wrong, Persona 3 FES isn't a hard game by any means, but the combat system did have some teeth to it and at least attempted to punish players for trying to slap their way through every combat situation by just blasting the enemy with their strongest skills on their best personas. While Persona 4 does still have tactics, technically, it's still clear that it was very much balanced with the intention that every party member's actions would be directly controlled by the player, and although I absolutely love Persona 3's combat, I don't have a problem with this fundamentally. Not only is this the standard for turn-based JRPGs since the dawn of time, and many games have managed to have enjoyable and dynamic combat with fully playable party members as a base, this is also an entirely new entry in the series, and any expectations that it should follow Persona 3 to the letter would only harm the experience, as the majority of P3's mechanics were so intrinsically tied to the themes and narrative of the one they were built for. But man, everything about Persona 4 Golden's combat, and by extension its dungeon crawling, is just so watered down to the point of inducing boredom. I would like to state before I explain my problems with Golden's combat that I did put some time into vanilla P4 just for fun during the production of this video, and while the objective difficulty was definitely toned down in the transition from vanilla to Golden, mostly by reworking the overtuned early game bosses and rehauling enemy affinities so they're not resistant to practically everything, I still don't think vanilla is all that more fun than Golden despite being harder, so most of my opinions apart from the skill card conundrums still apply. One more is still present, but becomes severely nerfed by the fact that being knocked down through a critical hit or a targeted weakness doesn't take away the combatant's next turn entirely. This function is replaced by the far less punishing dizzy status effect, which will only be inflicted on a combatant if they are already knocked down and then take an additional hit from something that would otherwise do so, and only then will they lose their next turn. This reworking of how party members and enemies can lose entire turns is simplified for sure, but isn't a deal breaker until you combine it with the newly added guard command. While consuming a party member's entire turn, guarding allows party members to take half damage and avoid getting knocked down even if the attack hitting them targets their weakness. And in practice, this means dizzy basically should never happen to a party member unless the player is extremely thoughtless or particularly unlucky. This ability to cover weaknesses essentially reduces dizzy to something that only the player will be exploiting the enemy with, since enemies are unable to guard, and results in combat that's just kind of completely neutered and lacking in any feelings of danger or tension by enabling the player to have far more agency in their ability to use mechanics to damage the enemy than the enemy has to do so to them. Removing the layers of strategy around weaknesses doesn't only come up in the context of the guard command, because a new feature in Golden that was not present in the original release is skill cards. Skill cards can be acquired through the completely rehauled shuffle time mechanic, which while existing in both P3 and vanilla P4, and even working differently between those two entries, neither iteration holds nearly the degree of pure beneficial utility as Golden shuffle time does. Besides the cup card refilling SP, in addition to HP being fucking broken and making resource management non-existent, I don't have a huge problem with Golden's take on shuffle time and much prefer it to the mess that was vanilla P4's. So what I really want to focus on here is the aforementioned skill cards. The skill cards were introduced in the enhanced remastered Persona 3 for the handheld console PlayStation Portable that was released in 2009, and go on to be featured prominently in Golden and every Persona game afterwards. They essentially serve to bypass certain annoyances and limitations of the Velvet Room Persona Fusion system to allow more precise customization regarding the skills the protagonist personas can learn. Upon receiving a skill card, which exists as a consumable item, the player can choose to use it on a certain persona in their current inventory, and through doing so teach the persona that skill. So if I had a skill card for the electricity magic skill Zio, I could use it on a persona of mine that would be unable to learn Zio through traditional fusion, or even just use it to bypass the tedium of all the menuing it takes in the Velvet Room to figure out the specifications to fuse that persona with that skill inherited. Despite potentially being a lazy way to save the player time and effort of interacting with and attempting to dig deeper into how fusing works, that's not really the problem I have with skill cards as a concept. The real way skill cards break the challenge of persona fusion, and therefore how the player chooses to use personas in combat, is that each persona comes with a predefined set of resistances and weaknesses, and a big part of PE3 FES's combat was purposely fusing personas with strategically beneficial resistances or lack of weaknesses, to have the specific skills that would target enemies' blind spots. The introduction of skill cards removes all of this and makes it so that if a boss is weak to a certain element, I can bypass the entire process I would have to go through in FES to have a fighting chance against it, and just slap my strongest skill card of that element onto my persona with the best magic stat and go to town. While skill cards are entirely optional to use, and I usually don't bother with them, the existence of something with that magnitude of strength that most players won't give a second thought to using just kind of fundamentally defines the issues I take with the entire design philosophy of Persona 4's combat, and eventually all the games that follow it, as one where almost every single mechanic exists to maximize damage dealt by the player, minimize the opponent's ability to pose tangible threat, and ultimately rarely ever challenge the player to think before blindly wailing on the enemy with their strongest attacks until the victory screen comes up. Hell, even if you do try to introduce added complexity for your own enjoyment, you're usually just making it harder for yourself because the optimal strategy is still, most likely, just slapping your way through, but this time with buffs and debuffs. And yes, I know a lot of these complaints sound silly because the vast majority of people who play modern Persona games play them for the social simulation and not the combat, but it really saddens me that the series went in such an uninspired direction with the way it balances combat, because even if FES wasn't hard, it still is my favorite take on turn-based in the entire genre, and is a major reason that game works so well for me, because it allowed me to have the same amount of fun in combat as I did in social simulation. In stark contrast, Persona 4's entire dungeon crawling half of the gameplay loop feels like a complete afterthought that you just gotta power through to get back to the far more engaging social simulation. Which admittedly, Persona 4 does boast what is most likely the strongest social sim experience the series has to offer. Social Link's functionality is more or less unchanged from FES, with some minor adjustments such as majorly cutting down on opportunities to reverse or break them, introducing route splits with school-age female characters based on if the player chooses to enter a romantic relationship with them or not, and the big one plastered across the back of the box: every party member has a social link. Yes, even the male ones. Now, I have a bit of an issue with this becoming the series standard that has less to do with the change itself and more with the overall ramifications it had on the purpose and variety of the social link system as a whole. If a non-party member character in a Persona game has a social link, it's because one of the writers had a character concept paired with an idea for how to elaborate on that concept in an interesting way within the framework of the system. Whether this concept is successfully executed on is beside the point, because there was an express purpose to that character's existence as part of the larger thematic importance of social links. The seed of narrative authenticity doesn't exist for party members because they're going to be a major part of the game with or without a SL. And I can't help but feel like the writers feeling obligated to give party members links, even when they might not be inspired with the concept for one, became a net negative for the series. It was the case with Fuka's link in Persona 3, and just gets worse from there, to the point that Persona 5 has more party member links that feel uninspired and obligatory than ones that don't. I'm torn on party members' ultimate personas being unlocked only when maxing out their link, instead of through story progression like in P3, because while I like the thematic thought behind the idea, it doesn't always end up adding more emotional impact to their links, since the vast majority of characters' individual emotional journeys are already resolved within the main story before it even becomes accessible. Only a few party members' SLs do anything interesting to offer continued exploration of these issues or introduce organic new ones, resulting in over half of them feeling like generic requirements for the player to have a strong party, while also being nowhere near as relatable or engaging as some non-party member ones that, by design, can't provide the same amount of tangible benefits. That being said, it's hard to argue that the actual content of P4's selection of social links doesn't meet the high standard of the best ones its predecessor had to offer, with a surprising amount of them even transcending that expectation of quality to reach brand new heights. While not totally doing away with the deconstructionist nature of P3's character writing, P4's links are far more grounded in their effort to portray all sorts of the unique personal struggles the people in Inaba face by approaching them with an increased amount of emphatic sentimentality, featuring some of the strongest character writing, most natural dialogue, and the very same earnest belief in the inherent good we are capable of as humans that define the social links in P3. I have virtually no issue saying that Persona 4 has the best selection of social links out of all three modern games. On my New Game Plus playthrough, I was able to complete a lot of the links I had to pass over the first time, and after having completed nearly all of them besides Yumi's, I can't even name one I would say is bad. While there's a couple I probably would never max out again, and I still think a few of the party member links aren't strong enough to justify their existence, the objective strength of nearly every social link in the game, combined with several welcome adjustments for how your social stats allow for or block progression through them, makes the social simulation of this entry so enjoyable and super satisfying to execute that you can very easily find yourself forgetting about the dungeons completely. Some of the standouts include one belonging to the very first character to join the party, Yosuke, who is an example of a party member's SL done right by running with the opportunity given as a way to provide additional dimensionality to a character that might have been unrealistic or flat out impossible to include in the main story. It does an excellent job elaborating on the crux of the issues brought up in the confrontation with his shadow self at the beginning of the game by examining what I interpret as his anxiety disorder and how that intersects with his own self-worth, the way he interacts with those around him, the resentment he once held for his life in Inaba, and his misplaced guilt over Saki's death. There's also the elderly woman Hisano, whose story revolves around MC trying to make sense of and eventually aid her in overcoming the irrational, ugly feelings of bitter anger and resentment that stem from survivor's guilt brought on by her husband's dementia and eventual death. This pairs well with another fantastic link belonging to the younger brother of a victim of the murders, Naoki, as he struggles to overcome the confusing nature of what he perceives as apathy to the situation, and eventually, with MC's help, experience some catharsis from the overwhelming grief he's been living with since his sister's murder. I also really love the twin links revolving around the fractured family MC is staying with. Uncle Dojima is a man who has become a workaholic to attempt to distance himself from the horrible, intrusive anger he can't help but feel towards his daughter after his wife's death in a hit and run while on the way to pick her up from school. And his 6-year-old daughter, Nanako, has struggled to put on a brave face while drowning in the loneliness inherent in her mother's passing and her father's estrangement, as all her attempts to connect meaningfully with the only family she has left fall short. The way these two links are handled with an equal amount of compassion for the pain of both child and parent was extremely poignant for me through its careful balancing of how children's tendency to remove personhood from their parents' actions can cause honest miscommunications to spiral out of control, while never attempting to make excuses for the very real mistakes Dojima has made as he tries to run away from the trauma inherent in communicating with his family. While these more traditional takes on the social link formula prove some of the best the series has to offer, Persona 4 goes a step further and tries some new things with a few of them as well. The biggest example of this is the Hermit link, which finds the player completing requests given to them by the fox that watches over the local dilapidated shrine, in hopes that making the wishes of Inaba's citizens come true will result in increased monetary offerings to help improve the shrine. These requests range anywhere from finding a random woman's lost wallet in the bushes and teaching a teenage girl how to relate better to her classmates, to catching the rarest fish in the local river in order to help an elderly resident complete his lifelong bucket list. This alone is a pretty cool take on what a social link can actually be, but the benefits of completing what are essentially fetch quests extends past just increased EXP when fusing personas in the Velvet Room, and this is because the fox is also an essential part of dungeon crawling. The fox follows the party into the TV world to hang out at the entrance, and when interacted with, you can pay a monetary fee to replenish you and your party's SP without having to leave entirely and come back the next day just to have the necessary resources to continue exploring. The amount required to do this is quite expensive, and especially in the early game, the player's money is better spent elsewhere. And also as a side both playthroughs, I never had more than 100,000 yen. Anyway, as the Fox's requests are completed and its social link ranked up, the flat cost per single SP replenished steadily decreases with each rank, and the overall price plummets significantly to the point at rank 10 you're usually paying only a few thousand yen to completely refill your entire party's empty SP gauges. I found this a really clever and immersive way to handle a full rework to some elements of the previous entry that kind of mucked up the design ethos of resource management while dungeon crawling. I've never seen this sentiment explicitly spoken on by the devs, but I always got the feeling that they really don't want you to solo an entire dungeon in 1 or 2 sessions, which is what the fatigue mechanic in P3 was supposed to help with. But because of the objective strength of returning to the entrance to Tartarus refilling all your health and SP for free, along with you and your party's resistance to fatigue becoming stronger the higher level they are, it didn't really have the intended effect. Meanwhile, the Fox does what fatigue was supposed to do and more by tying together multiple mechanical functions in a diegetic way that eventually becomes essential to introducing and elaborating on the game's overarching message of the importance of immersing yourself in your own community. Come late July, a third dead body is found belonging to the second year's homeroom, Mr. Muraoka, that is posed upside down on top of a television antenna, similar to the first 2 murders back in April. This stumps the investigation team as Mr. Muraoka never appeared on the Midnight Channel before his death, and furthermore, when they watch the Midnight Channel later that night, they see Mitsuo Kubo, who the player might remember as the creepy fish-eyed boy who asked Yukiko out on a date, and then angrily stormed off when she rejected him at the very beginning of the game. They go through the next dungeon in the TV world and confront Mitsuo, who insists he was responsible for all 3 of the murders, which they accept as the truth before beating Mitsuo's shadow and turning him into the police, as life seemingly goes back to normal for MC and his friends. This is of course a total red herring, as by the time most players will be beating Shadow Mitsuo, they'll have about 40 or so hours clocked on their save file, and if Persona 3 taught us nothing else, we at least know that Hoshino likes making long-ass games. I think the game does an adequate job making this false ending feel as though it could realistically be the finale of the game, while also leaving just enough inconsistencies to foster a feeling of dissatisfaction in the player if that was the case. But I do feel the way the writing decides to solve the paradox of how to progress the story past this point, by introducing a hyper-competent character that helps move the investigation along meaningfully, as just a bit disappointing because it ends up reducing participation on the player's part and trivializes a lot of the rest of the party's competency. At this point, the boy that was seen conversing with Kanji before his dungeon, and we've caught glimpses of standing around town over the course of the game, is introduced properly as the brilliant young detective working with the Inaba Police Department to help solve the serial murder case, Naoto Shirogane. During the elaborate Persona 3 reference that is the school ride trip to Tatsumi Port Island in early August, it's revealed that Naoto is suspicious of the fact that every kidnapped victim who has returned unharmed has begun to hang out together, and during a wild night at Club Escapade attempts to get the investigation team to reveal what they know about the case. The entire group at this point is behaving as if they were drunk, and before Naoto, in a fit of exasperation, points out that none of the drinks have alcohol in them, Yukiko spills the beans about the TV world. Once home from the trip, Naoto appears on the local news in an attempt to become the next kidnapping victim and find out more about the TV world, but of course the investigation team jumps in to save him when he is. While there is like a metric fuck ton of things that can be discussed about the resolution in Naoto's dungeon, particularly regarding the reveal that Naoto is actually female and has been cross-dressing to be taken seriously in her male-dominated line of work as a detective, all these discussion points are part of a whole clusterfuck of egregiously messy identity politics inherent to how the writing handles this reveal. As much as I really like Naoto and can deeply relate to her struggles to cope with her body dysphoria and define her identity in a way that she could feel comfortable with and maybe even one day be proud of, the exceedingly sloppy execution here only serves to obscure what makes Naoto's story one of the most important ones in the game. See, the actual crux of Naoto's emotional turmoil is her long-term repression of the parts of herself she perceives as childish, and an attempt to get the adults around her to recognize her contributions to the profession she takes so seriously. This in turn makes the entire detective work as a male-dominated field, so I cross-dress to be taken more seriously, incredibly redundant, next to her already understandable reasons for desiring validation from the adults who control her ability to do the job she is clearly good at, loves to do, and holds massive sentimental importance for her. This ultimately minor detail has led to a large-scale misattribution of importance placed on what is only one facet of an impactful scene showing a young person realizing they forced themselves to grow up too fast, and in the process missed out on a lot of what makes being young formative. This central conceit that drives Naoto's character arc is an important one to elaborate on another of the game's larger overarching themes: the death of idealistic childhood and the birth of the glittering, limitless expanse of adulthood. There's a widely held sentiment among both teenagers and adults in Japanese society that once a person graduates school and enters into the workforce as a fully fledged adult, the spontaneity, fun, and excitement of their lives comes to an abrupt end, and all that's left is defined by stress, monotonous repetition, and even inherent unhappiness. In a 2022 article featured on Nippon.com, Japanese sociologist Doi Takayoshi details several of his observations of the young people in Japan and posits that a likely reason for this viewpoint is related to the economic stagnation the country has been stuck in since the business boom Japan experienced in the 80s and 90s. He attributes a lot of the behaviors and societal beliefs among young people to this shift, but the one that really struck me as applicable to Persona 4's central message was this. During the growth years, everyone had some higher goal towards which they were striving, even if they were climbing different mountains. Today, with the goals less clear and the judgment criteria in flux, people look increasingly to their neighbors for guidance on how to behave. Everyone is watching everyone else for clues and getting more and more anxious. Accompanying this anxiety is a pronounced tendency towards social fragmentation. Since the 2000s, people have attempted to reduce the stress of interpersonal relationships by confining their interactions to a narrow group of peers with very similar values. In this era of growing diversity, people seek stability and reassurance by limiting their interactions to a closed circle of friends who share the same values, income level, and lifestyle. This very real phenomenon of mass paranoia and anxiety brought on by simply living in modern society eventually birthed a niche subculture in Japanese otaku media, often referred to as denpa, a word that literally translates to electromagnetic waves, and uses the imagery of anxiety and mania bred from belief in far-fetched conspiracy theories like, the government is using 5G to broadcast subliminal messages to us, to exemplify this widespread feeling of dread-filled isolation, which can lead to a surrealist blurring of lines between reality and fantasy that many of us can relate to from the act of simply living in an age of technology defined by relative financial security. Denpa as a genre in fiction is hard to quantify, and getting into the nitty-gritty of the subculture is far too deep of a rabbit hole to go down for this video. But I've always been sort of fascinated by the core concepts behind it, and as time goes on, I find it easier and easier to relate them to the imagery Persona 4 uses to communicate a larger message across the entire work. The importance of cutting through the things in life that want to sever our connection to each other, particularly how the mass media can be wielded to prey upon the very natural fear and anxiety we experience as members of the human race, to sensationalize and eventually depreciate the value we see in connecting with each other on a deeper level. While all modern Persona games place heavy importance on the core theme of connecting with those our time on Earth is shared with in close proximity to, and the power inherent in doing so, all three of them choose to examine, in extreme depth, entirely different vehicles inherent to modern life that often attempt to drive a wedge in our ability to do so. Where in P3 the classical depiction of fleeting mortality and humanity's fear of the inevitability of its end is what stands in the way of MC and other major characters' ability to relate to each other in more meaningful capacities, Persona 4 highlights an entirely different and very relevant to the time period the game was made in, big bad attempting to hinder our ability to understand each other genuinely, the media, and goes a step further by hypothesizing the larger impact it has had on not just individual relationships, but entire communities. The theme of community is most clearly elaborated on by the Fox social link, where, as I explained previously, the player is tasked with completing small, usually multi-step requests for help given by the townspeople, and by doing so is rewarded with decreased costs for using the Fox's healing service while in the dungeon. While the Hermit SL is the most prominent example, it is nowhere near the only one that can be cited when looking at how the game forces you to pay attention to the many non-playable characters that populate the town of Inaba. In Persona 3, the Velvet Room attendant Elizabeth tasks the player with a long list of entirely optional requests that boast a variety of rewards ranging anywhere from minorly helpful to some of the rarest items in the game, depending on how difficult the request is to complete. The function of Elizabeth's request is replaced in P4 by whatever this is. While this water droplet emoji visual indicator was added in Golden to make keeping track of the existence of town people's requests, and if they were currently in progress easier, the quests themselves still function the exact same between versions. By speaking to various nondescript citizens around town, many of them will give you the option to hear out their request for something, usually an item procured in certain dungeons, though occasionally it can be other things like answering a riddle, listening to their lecture, or even a series of trade sequences with other NPCs. And by successfully completing their request and reporting back to them, they will award the player with a variety of rewards depending on how hard it was to complete. These requests are a bit easier to lose track of and don't typically boast the same inherent value and completion that Elizabeth's did. But even then, the vast majority of them are easy enough to do, and it even became kind of fun for me to recognize an item someone was looking for while dungeon crawling, and then run around town reporting back to everyone, and reading their overjoyed dialogue as they come to realize, if only slightly, the value of connecting with and trusting in another member of their community. I actually found myself quite proud when one NPC that hung out in the floodplain expressed gratitude to me for completing his previous request, and went on to say that he knew if anyone in town could find a modest lamp, it would be me. While the NPC requests are completely optional and usually not entirely worth the tedium that come attached to carrying them out, their existence along with the Fox SL do a great job of repurposing side content that might not have worked all that well in the transition from 3 to 4 in a way that feels natural, non-intrusive, and even poignant at times. In addition, the NPCs around town boast a wide array of ever-changing flavor dialogue, often expressing their individual perspectives on the events of the story that affect them and their lives in Inaba, while very gradually becoming more and more defined by anxiety, worry, mania, and eventually apathy, as the effects of the TV world fog start to take hold and twist their ability to discern reality from aberration. While all of the modern Persona games employ similar importance placed on the frankly utterly insane amount of NPC dialogue that exists in them, as essential to the way they like to integrate the player into a world that feels as if it's bursting at the seams with authentic liveliness. Persona 4, in my opinion, uses this and many other elements like it to the greatest effect out of all the entries in the series. Almost everyone has been to somewhere similar to Inaba, if not living there, at least visited a place like it for any amount of time. And basically everyone can admit there is an undeniable quiet comfort in them. The relaxing, cozy, and yet at the same time almost limitless feeling that places like it elicit in us comes from what I believe is the intersection of the familiarity inherent in the scenery of modern human civilization and the abject isolation that envelops it. Like an oasis in the desert, the juxtaposition of community and commerce against complete nothingness that exudes from living in a small rural town like Inaba is a large factor in why so many people enjoy doing so. And through the extremely meticulous art direction and design work throughout, Persona 4 is somehow able to quite literally bottle this feeling and sell it. On the subject of art direction and design, P4's graphic design, and by extension the entire art direction, again credited to Shigenori Sojima as the last mainline game in the series he served as lead art director on, is probably the most easily identifiable and distinctive among all 3 entries. The trademark sunshine yellow, paired with the distinctive minimal rainbow accents, is incredibly striking and unique in how it's utilized, especially when paired with the prominent use of thin vertical lines, and in the golden branding, various shapes resembling flowers, sparkles, bullseyes, and other mid-century inspired design elements that immerse you in a throwback vibe, very reminiscent of the graphic design ethos used in commercials and advertisements of the 1950s and 60s. This in turn contrasts so well against the muted, flat color palette and overall dingy visual design of the environments in Inaba, to make looking at and interfacing with the UI, HUD, and menus feel like the act of watching an actual ad break in between a television show, which is just so fucking cool as a concept and so well executed on in gameplay. The other defining element of the game's ability to submerge the player in a very attentional mood and tone is, of course, the music. I realized after finishing the P3 FES video that despite the overwhelming praise I heaped onto the soundtrack, I failed to actually credit the person who has brought so many of Atlus's games to life, with his fantastic musical composition and understanding of how important music can be to cultivate entire identities for the games he writes for. So with the proper amount of reverence this time, let me just say, Shoji Meguro was on some good shit when writing the soundtrack for Persona 4. While Persona 3's OST melded a variety of genres, instruments, and moods together that worm their way into your heart and create a cohesive experience despite the vast amount of sounds and styles they cover, Persona 4's OST opts to stick to very specific elements reminiscent of not only J-pop of the time, but also pulls from the history of pop music across the entire genre, that works to create an exceptionally distinctive sound all its own. In a 2008 interview with Play Magazine, Meguro revealed that he doesn't listen to much music by other artists, so as to not influence his own compositions, and therefore most of his exposure to pop music of the era was through TV commercials, and any snippets he would catch on the radio while out and about. While I'm no technical music expert, and therefore can't speak to exactly what composition choices and specific techniques make Persona 4's music sound as unique as it does, this tidbit regarding Meguro's listening habits makes perfect sense in the context of Persona 4's OST, playful use of brassy horns, sparkling synthesizers, electric rock guitar stingers, and playful piano melodies just dripping in bittersweet nostalgia, all tied together with the bow that is Shihoko Hirata's bouncy yet soaring pop vocals, come together and create a soundtrack that has just the right amount of prepackaged J-pop and commercial jingle goodness, alongside enough rock and electronic fusion elements to not come off as too plasticky or fake. This unique sound eventually comes to define the experience of Persona 4 as a whole, and while Meguro lightens up on the sheer amount of leitmotifs that were present in P3's soundtrack, the emotional core of Persona 4's OST delivers on the feelings of youthful joy and wonder present in the game's art direction and writing in a way that communicates so much more than any of these elements can do on their own. These visual and auditory elements and how they, among many other things, intersect with much of the descriptions and flavor text existing in Inaba, even in Golden, which, like I stated, stands inferior to vanilla in this department, is able to very carefully cultivate the dueling points of view of the comfort many can't help but feel gazing out on the picturesque countryside of rural Japan, alongside just how much of a desolate location on the decline can feel dull, boring, and even claustrophobic to a teenager from the big city forced to move there. While I grew up in a relatively large city, much of my childhood was spent residing in plain suburbs on the outskirts of it. I used to ride my bike way out into the hill country surrounding the newly developed neighborhood where my father and stepfamily lived in Maynard, Texas, and watch the evening sun hang heavy on the horizon over a man-made reservoir, as I wondered if I would ever come to enjoy living in a place so trite and rigid. I cannot begin to describe exactly how the Samagawa floodplain area in this game inspired me to relive those quiet, contemplative moments of my youth. Though this time with the maturity to not just resonate and sympathize with my 12-year-old self raw feelings of being trapped somewhere I felt I didn't belong, but also understand the foolishness inherent to them, and even mourn how they led me to spend most of my early teens refusing to broaden my understanding of the world around me in favor of losing myself in fantasy of something if not greater, at least more interesting. The few empty soda cans that litter the bank of the man-made lake MC fishes in, seeming to suggest rebellious young people coming to smoke cigarettes and dangle their legs off the large concrete blocks. The small, unassuming gazebo that many of the most poignant moments in the story and social links take place underneath. The massive power lines that loom and crisscross over the horizon like skyscrapers. And even the smaller dressings like this fucking trash can. Or the chain-link fence draped with forest green tarps lining the open area at the end. And even the tall, delicate wildflowers among spindling weeds peppering the grassy areas show an incredible attention to detail by someone who harbors complex, yet ultimately fond memories of a location similar to it, an environment that would be nothing but nondescript padding in any other video game. Every area in the game, apart from maybe the metropolitan location added in Golden, Okina City, is filled with the same fastidious interest in the details of the setting, both large and small, that make up Inaba, and how they all contribute to the overall mood's ability to demonstrate and elaborate on the important dichotomy between idealistic nostalgia for a simpler time in our lives and an air of wistful grief regarding how we might have wasted that precious time. After a series of tangled events that eventually lead to the investigation team deducing the real culprit behind the initial murders of Mayumi Yamano and Sakiko Nishi, which I won't get too much into because despite ultimately not caring about spoilers all that much, in service of delivering the most comprehensive analysis I can, I do still think the trip down the rabbit hole to reach the identity of the true culprit is valuable to experience even if you already know who it is beforehand. And also because the thought of writing out the intentionally convoluted way it all unfolds in an easily understandable way gives me a headache. Anyway, at the end of the day, it's ultimately demise that the bumbling junior detective working under Uncle Dojima, Toru Adachi, carried out the initial murders and has been working behind the scenes to lead the cops, investigation team, and ultimately the entire town towards accepting falsities as resolution. Hashido has been open about the writing team's troubles when trying to decide who would be the ultimate culprit behind the murders, stating they even at one point intended for the murderer to be a party member like Yosuke or Yukiko, which I'm relatively sure this concept sowed the seeds for Persona 5's twist villain party member. But luckily, them landing on the character of Adachi, who initially existed as a diegetic way to feed otherwise unattainable information about the case to the investigation team, led to the birth of a fantastic antagonist worthy of what the entire game has been leading up to. Adachi's motives were not only the initial murders, but his eventual desire to see Inaba and the TV world merge into one, and every human being become mindless shadows living out the rest of their days in the bliss of ignorance. Sounds like a lame cop-out at first, because in the end, what drove him to engage in this game of cat and mouse for so long was something as simple as the contempt he holds for how boring living in Inaba is for him. In the investigation team's final confrontation with Adachi, he details how he wasted the majority of his teens studying and working hard so he could succeed in school, get a good job, marry a nice woman, and obtain what the adults around him insisted would be a happy and fulfilling life. After graduating from the police academy, which he admits he only chose to attend so he could legally carry a gun, he went on to work as a detective in a large city before making some kind of undisclosed mistake while doing so, and was subsequently demoted and transferred to Nowheresville, Inaba as punishment. Ever since then, Adachi has quit caring about his own well-being and lives his life defined by nihilism, resentment, isolation, and pure unadulterated spite for the world and people in it that he thinks forced him to waste his entire life up until now for the promise of an idealistic life defined by comfort and stability that was so incredibly fragile, it might as well have never existed at all. Adachi's experiences existing as a clear foil to the relative fun and excitement built through connection that MC's life in Inaba has been defined by is a perfect capstone demonstrating how important the player's actions as a participant in the game's world have been up until now. Despite the art direction and narrative placing heavy emphasis, especially in the opening hours, on just how little there is to do or see in Inaba, the player, as MC's guide, has been able to overcome this nihilistic viewpoint and invest close to 100 hours of time and effort into their life here, and by doing so, inject overwhelming personal meaning into it. Upon defeating Adachi, he morphs into the terrifying overseer of the fog and the self-professed granter of humanity's desires, Ami no Sagiri, who goes on to proclaim that the people of Inaba, and by extension all of mankind, truly wants their world to be enveloped by the fog and become shadows living in the ignorance of the desolate world that will follow. It explains that it didn't create the Midnight Channel and has no part in what appears on it, as it's simply broadcasting the collective consciousness of Inaba and what they desire to believe is the truth. The deity decided to give humanity one last chance to avoid this fate after observing the hidden potential among those who entered the TV world to awaken to the power of persona, and decided to challenge the investigation team to see just how far they would go in the search of the truth by amplifying the object of their pursuit, Adachi's pre-existing disillusionment and disdain for humanity, in order to eventually challenge them in one final battle to prove their convictions. Thus, among the stylized TV world clouds soaring above a bird's-eye view of the landscape of Inaba, the investigation team chooses to stand true to their belief in the power for humanity to decide what we want for ourselves, and face Ami no Sagiri in a battle with the weight of this resolve on their shoulders.
Defy me is a senseless act which goes against your world's wishes. Let us begin.
While the boss fight itself is rather disappointing as an actual challenge, I do still absolutely love the visual design of it as a massive, technicolored eyeball, defined by the pipes extinguishing the mania-inducing fog all across its form. And I actually do want to shout out to the anime on this one for even improving on this design by making the radial, multicolored rings that define its iris resemble that of an expensive video camera. After defeating Ami no Sagiri, it recognizes the investigation team's will as the will of all of mankind, but warns them that if humanity ever comes to desire ignorance again, it will return. Adachi is apprehended and imprisoned for the murders, the fog lifts, Nanako and Dojima make miraculous full recoveries from the previous events, and the investigation team can finally sit back, relax, and enjoy the newfound clarity of the world and the people they've come to love and fought so hard to protect. The battle against Ami no Sagiri that ties up the events of the game in a tidy package serve as the finale in the vanilla version of the game, and despite Golden adding the whole month of January and end of February for the player to tie up loose ends and complete some of the side content in the game they might have not had time to beforehand, it's still effectively the last overarching plot-related happenings in both versions. That is until the final day before MC leaves Inaba in order to return to living with his parents in the city. To get the good ending, which stands on its own as a conclusion just about anyone could accept as satisfying, the player simply has to say goodbye to all the social links they fully completed over the course of the game, and go back to rest until MC's train back home in the morning.
Huh? What a coincidence! It must...
Oh, so you guys came here too!
It's our very own special headquarters.
Yo there, Senpai. I thought you'd be here.
We had a feeling we'd run into everyone if we came here.
We were planning on seeing you off at the station tomorrow, but I was feeling too restless.
Well, since we're all here, what...
Ooh, let's have steak! Steak! And
Will you shut up about your steaks?
But if the player picks up on a few very subtle hints during these farewells, and selects the no option when prompted to return home after completing them, they can then go to the Junes food court to meet up with the entire investigation team one final time, where they will then discuss some of the nagging loose ends to the case, like where the Midnight Channel actually came from, and who gave Adachi, Namatame, and MC the power to go into the TV world in the first place. They will then be given extra time to ask around town about these unanswered questions in the otherwise closed case, and after doing so, eventually return to talk to the Dojimas at the floodplain. Here, Nanako will remind MC of his meeting with the gas station attendant, boasting a suspiciously unique design at the very beginning of the game, and only then can the player return to Main Street and confront the very same attendant about this seemingly chance encounter. After pressing the issue repeatedly despite multiple dialogue options insisting they give up, the player eventually is able to revoke the gas station attendant to reveal that they were in fact the one that gave Adachi, Namatame, and MC the ability to enter the TV through orchestrated meetings when they first moved to Inaba. They go on to reveal their true nature as the Japanese goddess of death, Izanami, who in the real-world Japanese mythological creation myth was the partner of the god Izanagi, a name the player might recognize as the same as the MC's original persona when he awoke to his power. Izanami bestowed the ability to enter the TV world and awaken to the power of persona to individuals who embodied aspects of the human experience, with the potential to have a great impact on mankind as a whole. Adachi representing emptiness, Namatame representing despair, and MC representing hope. She went on to spread rumors of the Midnight Channel in order to see which of these dueling facets would win over society, in order to determine the nature of the desires she would grant to them. Eventually, she observed that Adachi's ideology of nihilism and the preference to live completely blind to the truth of the world had the most effect on the population of Inaba, and therefore she sent Amino Sagiri to shroud the world in fog and grant humanity the ignorance they so crave. Finally, she beckons MC and his friends to meet her at the end of the TV world, if they so dare, and thereby unlocks the final dungeon, which must be completed in a single day. After fighting through all of Yomotsu Hirasaka, which resembles the foggy environment that Izanami brought MC to in his dreams, in order to entice him to seek the truth and spread his ideology of hope, the investigation team finally reaches the true end of their journey as they confront Izanami and resolve to fight to uncover the truth at the center of the universe, and stop Amino Sagiri and the fog from ever threatening mankind again.
Man, it's hazy.
worse than this thing. This is just the send-off our leader deserves. All right, time for the grand finale.
Knowledge of the truth is not everything. Yet drunk with truth, you exceeded your role and became too involved. Now, learn for yourselves whose wrath you have brought down.
All right, let's go, guys.
Then come, sinful sons of man.
Izanami as a final boss is a great encapsulation of everything Persona 4 does get right and everything it falls short on. At an appropriate endgame level across the entire party, Izanami is reduced to a simple, mechanic-light DPS check like every other boss in the game, which is majorly disappointing, especially when compared to Persona 3's Nyx, who despite some of my qualms with the practicality of her design, was extremely effective in serving as a true test of the player's mastery over the moment-to-moment combat, persona fusion, and time invested in the game as a whole. Much like Amino Sekiri, there's no real strategy to beating Izanami besides the baseline Persona combat loop of staying on top of healing, buffs, debuffs, and guarding when she's charging up a big attack. She won't even use the skills that remove the effects of buffs and debuffs like the Kaja or the Kunda as much as some of the other bosses, so engaging in turn economy manipulation isn't rewarding, and even the threat of her mini instant kill spells aren't all that scary because the game is so generous with actually useful item drops that you'll have a surplus of homunculi and SP items to tank the hit or revive anyone who falls to them with relative ease. And even despite my disappointment, the actual challenge she poses falls severely short of what it could be, which stems from the game's lackluster combat design philosophy. Izanami is still one of, if not my favorite final boss in the series, when I think about the over-the-top spectacle and earnest feelings of triumph and awe finally overcoming her elicited in me.
I am a god. I'll teach you the truth of your minuscule existences.
This battle will determine our future.
You cannot defeat me with strength alone.
Look out! We've never seen anything like her!
The song that plays during the second phase, the Genesis, is genuinely one of my favorite songs from not just the Persona series, but any video game, as it perfectly captures the nature of the fervent tug-of-war between powers of hope and virtue the protagonists wield in the fight to prove their ideology in the face of the almighty force of a god, by illustrating these dueling forces through leitmotifs and instruments specific to them. Beginning with brooding, erratic string and marching percussion instruments as Izanami reveals her true form of a grotesque skeleton draped in crimson blood and rotting flesh, that over the course of the song begins to try to overwhelm and extinguish the swelling horns, singing the melody of the generic boss theme for the game, I Will Face Myself, embodying MC and his friend's steadfast determination to prevail in the face of adversity. The way this battle of attrition between the warring musical styles representing the factions engaging in it eventually begins to fall into a pattern that mimics the back and forth nature of turn-based combat itself, which will never cease to give me goosebumps. This amazing theme is combined with an awe-inspiring arena that frames the party as almost small, irrelevant specks beneath the wonderful and vast expanse of the universe Starscape, that really hammers home the breathtaking nature of what a final boss in a JRPG should be, while staying true to the spirit of the rest of the game.
So few surpass the will of all mankind. How can your powers rival mine? Why don't you understand? It's impossible for humans to grasp the truth with their own heads.
After defeating the orchestrator behind it all, as the dust settles and it starts to sink in that our long journey has finally come to an end, the Velvet Room's limousine arrives at its destination, and MC, with his friends by his side, step out into the newly cleansed TV world, as we're finally able to see it for what it truly is and was always meant to be. The magnificent, shimmering, bright and brilliant scenery that exists within the hearts of all of mankind.
So this is the world inside people's hearts. It feels nice. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Unlike with Persona 3, where brand new gameplay structures and systems were initially conceptualized and refined with the intention to effortlessly slot into how they represent the game's ultimate thesis, Persona 4 has the somewhat awkward honor of being the first game to have to repurpose these existing systems to attempt to fit into a different story with different narrative intentions. This, along with the fact that Persona's writing as a whole is kind of anime sloppish in nature, which is a topic I'll speak more on depth when I discuss the same thing in relation to Persona 5, has resulted in many different interpretations of what exactly P4 is about, most of which reduce its thematic depth to a few buzzwords and a handful of hot-button topics that only serve to muddy the waters more than they already are. Before I begin to elaborate on my personal interpretation of the game's larger thesis, I'd like to make it clear that this is only one of the many ways this game's larger message can be interpreted, even if the way I came to understand it was influenced and largely supported by my understanding of Japanese societal beliefs and comments from Hoshino himself. I'm not by any means saying that my reading of the game is the absolute correct one, or that my interpretation can't be flawed, as it's ultimately influenced by my individual experiences and how they have shaped my personal methods when analyzing the meaning behind art. But I can, at the very least, say I've probably thought a lot more seriously about this in the 6 months it took me to make this video than most of the people on Twitter who shit on Persona 4's handling of its themes, and very few of which can give any substantially believable argument as to why. Truth is spoken about a lot throughout the game. The phrase true self is thrown around incessantly during every character's shadow confrontation. Anything pertaining to Izanami and the secret finale of the game harps on the MC's ability to perceive the truth through the lies. The main diegetic thematic motif of the game is quite literally just the fog that makes you manic, which becomes thicker and thicker throughout the town as the events of the game move towards their peak. I mean, hell, the entire linchpin for most of the plot is a fucking murder mystery. While these constant references to truth and the very prominent visual theming of television and allusions to the way the media can influence us can hardly be ignored by anyone who's played Persona 4, rather ironically, the evocative effect of these concepts having so much emphasis put on them, along with a rather sparse, explicit elaboration as to why, usually ends up obscuring the actual message the game might be trying to convey with them. Persona 4 is a game that cares a lot more about how the act of playing it makes you feel than any of the actual mechanical functions within it while doing so. And while this concept is relevant among every modern Persona game, Persona 4 in particular, it basically becomes the entire project's identity. This acute curation and fastidious focus on creating the feeling of the environment the game places the player inside of work to craft atmosphere, ambiance, and just straight up vibes so intentional, so precise, so affecting that we, as the many people playing the game, are thrust into a shared experience not all that dissimilar from the collective town of Inaba. In turn, every single person that makes up the audience taking part in this shared experience while going through the events of the game and spending time in the world begin to impress upon the malleable nature of Persona 4 as it exists within the medium of a video game, and through doing so become a stand-in for the community of Inaba itself, thereby broadcasting ourselves as we exist both collectively and individually to the real-life world that surrounds us, just as the Midnight Channel does with the characters and larger town's community in the game. And this is why I put such a massive disclaimer regarding my interpretation of this game's ultimate storytelling goal not being a definitive one. I am fully aware of how insane it sounds to say, Persona 4 is a metafiction masterpiece painstakingly creating a shared experience among its audience that forces every single person who plays it to become part of and participate in the collective consciousness, which mirrors the characters and events of the game, to serve as a point of commentary on not just the importance of fiction as a tool to connect us, but also directly condemning the idea that mass media is anything more than a flawed reflection of humanity's timeless desperation for clarity and meaning where there is none. Just as I'm more than willing to admit I could be totally full of shit when posing it. But I didn't come up with this crazy conspiracy theory out of thin air, and believe it or not, what actually sparked me to think about Persona 4 in this way was a sentiment expressed by Hoshino himself I stumbled upon while researching the game for this video. In an interview for the Persona 4 Club Book in 2008, shortly after the game's release, Hoshino speaks at length about the arduous process he and the team went through while trying to craft an authentically intriguing murder mystery, filled with red herrings, false ends, and shocking twists. He explains that while the concept of Izanami as the endgame's antagonist existed even before the core themes and message of the game had been ironed out, due to Persona 3's heavy use of Greek mythological theming and narrative illusion, which inspired them to decide at the very beginning of development to continue this tradition and focus on Japanese mythology in Persona 4. The extreme subtlety in which the hints Izanami as a secret, true final boss existing at all are communicated with, along with the convoluted series of actions and choices the player must make to actually access her, aren't just a byproduct of outdated game design philosophy though. Because later on in the interview, Hoshino explains that this is completely by design. The ultimate intention in its execution was for the vast majority of players to not experience the true ending at all on their first playthrough. Instead, they wanted first-time players to get the good ending, consisting of defeating only Amano Sagiri, and then afterwards go on to seek out discussion on the game from others they knew that had played it, and perhaps even seen the true ending. Through this authentic connection built upon a shared experience, the player would learn about the existence of a more definitive ending, and then make a choice to go back and play through the entire game again with a new perspective, now influenced by others close to them. Therefore, literally forcing the players to experience and participate in a community of their own, just to experience the truth at the end of the journey, as the MC in the game did as well. This real-world meta-contextualization of not only the entire game's premise, but the impressionable nature in the very act of creating, experiencing, and sharing art with one another is an incredibly profound one, that despite the relative intangibility in its philosophy, filters down into one very simple truth. The beautiful fact that we as humans choose to use our God-given autonomy on reaching out and touching one another's minds in any way possible, eventually becoming the daisy chain that links every soul in the world together as one. While Persona 3 is very literal in its depictions of the importance of life through the lens of the finite nature of death, Persona 4 instead frames life as constantly changing, ever evolving, always growing, and never ceasing to continue to reinvent itself time and time again. And at the end of the day, I think the intersection between these two ideas becomes the real thematic messaging behind Persona 4. Although humanity seems to exist in a constant state of figurative death and rebirth, and the anxiety inherent to the never-ending uncertainty of such an existence can result in painful isolation, the only real way to ease this pain is through the genuine comfort in truly and meaningfully understanding another person. Adachi gave up on this truth. Namatame unraveled under the weight of creating his own version of it. But what did we do? We reach out to it, and that will remain true until the end of time.
Everyone's heart is connected to the people they know and trust. It's those bonds that let us all search for our purpose in life. As long as it's a purpose you believe in, there will always be someone who can help you fulfill it. You, me, and everyone else, there are no barriers. Our hearts are one, right, Sensei?